Well, good morning, Hawaii. Thank you so much for joining us here on this Wednesday for Spotlight Hawaii. I'm Yenji Denise, joined by Ryan Kalei-Suji. Of course, this is the platform of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser, where we bring on guests from around the world to talk about what's happening here in the islands. And we are very lucky, Ryan, to have a very special guest today.
That's why joining us this morning is someone who's been on the program in the past and has a lot of insight about what's happening in our nation's capital. Joining us this morning is U.S. Senator Brian Schatz. Good morning, Senator. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. Good to see you both.
You know, we have a lot to get to. Obviously, we want to talk about some of the assignments that you have been assigned to in your new committee and the roles that you will play in the U.S. Senate, as well as everything that's happened on January 6th and the impeachment trial of the former president. But we want to start off with what's impacting Hawaii residents the most. And of course, that is COVID-19 and the impact that this pandemic continues to have on our community. What can you tell us about the Biden administration's COVID relief package and where we are right now with that?
Well, we're in pretty good shape. I mean, obviously we have a lot of work to do, but we have broad agreement that the package should be $1.9 trillion, that it should provide money for vaccines, that we will actually have the biggest investment in Native communities in American history, that there's going to be money for schools and for state and county government. And so we have broad agreement about the categories of relief. And now we're just kind of fine tuning it. The House will pass their version of the package probably next Thursday or next Friday. And then we'll take it up either the week following or the week after that. But the intent is to pass this package certainly by the middle of March, where there's a so-called unemployment cliff, after which we literally run out of unemployment funds. So I don't want to overpromise because, you know, it's still the Congress and things could go sideways, but we're moving at a determined pace and we have broad agreement about what is necessary. And I think for Hawaii, it's the money for vaccines, it's money to help people to stay in their homes, either rental housing or to prevent them from losing their homes through the loss of their mortgage. And it's money for the state government to be able to plug the budget hole, because I think they've been delivering services, but they just don't have the revenue because tourism has taken a nosedive. So we're in reasonably good shape. We have a lot of very hard work and hard negotiating to do, but I'm, somewhat more confident than I was last year that we're going to be able to pass a package.
I'm really interested in that, in the relief for cities and for states. One of the things that obviously was left off CARES Act 2 was this relief for state budgets. And it's something that the state government here now is grappling with. $1.4 billion, as you know, is the deficit that they're facing. What kind of an impact or how much money do you know? I mean, it's probably hard to say specific dollars now, but what kind of relief could Hawaii expect if things progress in a way that is hopefully going to happen?
Well, it could be enough to prevent all layoffs and furloughs. It wouldn't prevent the sort of structural problem of having a sort of underpowered economy and therefore state revenues that just aren't there over a, say, 2 or 4 year period. But if our collective objective is to simply survive this moment until we have enough vaccinations and enough herd immunity that we can get our lives back and our economy back, I think it's going to be enough for that. I think it's going to be enough for us to prevent the layoff of public workers or the furloughing of public workers. This is my number one priority, partly because although previous relief packages were great, none of them had this kind of flexible money for state and county government. And this is a real high priority for Democrats going forward. I do think that it will plug the budget hole in the short term, not necessarily fix any structural problems with the deficit in state government, but it should get us through this crisis.
And of course, one issue that many continue to grapple with is just unemployment and the benefits. We'll actually be speaking with the director on Friday about that issue here locally. But what can we see in terms of relief for unemployment benefits? Because we know that is a separate line item, if you will, in that budget. And what kind of support will those who continue to struggle with finding a job, what kind of things could they see out of this CARES package?
Well, I think, first of all, it'll be an extension of the PPP program, which some businesses have loved and some have not loved. But there are also other programs that were in the last relief package for closed venues. That could be small community theater, It could be a place that provides a venue for live music. And we're working with the SBA to get those rules clarified and get that program laid out, because certainly lots of our folks in our art community are really struggling financially. And so there's a specific program for that. And we hope to do something specific for restaurants. Any place, any economic strategy that requires the gathering of people has suffered the most. So it's restaurants, it's hospitality, and it's venues. And that's why Hawaii has done very well on the COVID side, but very poorly on the economic side, because we depend on gathering. That's the kind of lifeblood of our economy, and people haven't been able to do it. So we're working very hard on that. And then we'll look at another extension of the unemployment benefits, probably at a slightly lower dollar amount, but still enough to enable people to, survive, to pay their rent, to pay for their groceries and handle their utilities.
You also mentioned funding for vaccines there. Hawaii's issue, when we talked to the state health director, Dr. Libby Char, says that they could do 80,000 vaccines a week, but right now they're limited to far less than that because of just the doses that they're getting on the federal side. What more do you think can be done so that Hawaii gets more doses so that the vaccine can, get into shots into arms sooner?
I think this is a really important point. We were not sure whether the sort of limiting factor was going to be our logistical capacity in the state of Hawaii, or was it going to be the supply of vaccines? Right now, the logistics are up and running to handle much more vaccine coming from the mainland. And I do think much more vaccine is going to come from the mainland. We have an interruption due to the weather over the last 48 hours, but generally speaking, week after week, the number of vaccines coming into the state of Hawaii has gone up and up and up. And I think if Johnson & Johnson gets its emergency use authorization, as we expect that they will, that's just a one jab thing, which makes for way easier logistics. I visited the Queens facility and the Pier 2 facility, and both of them are telling me that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine will be a game changer, and hundreds of millions of doses will be available. So I'm somewhat hopeful about the availability of vaccine over the next 6 weeks. It's sort of never enough until you have enough for anybody to walk into a CVS or a Long's or Kaiser or Queens and just say, I'd like to be vaccinated. So we're not going to be there for a couple more months. But I think it's worth emphasizing this vaccine is pretty much of a miracle of modern science. It really works. It's going to save your life. It is going to give you your life back, even if you're sort of, you feel like you're personally safe. The ability to visit with other vaccinated individuals, to hug your mother, to visit your grandmother, you get your life back. This thing is a miracle, and we should start talking about it in those terms. I think part of what happened during COVID is the news was so bad for so long and always getting worse that we're not recognizing what miraculously good news the vaccine is. And it gives us the possibility of having our lives back by sometime in the summer if we make sure that everybody feels good about getting vaccinated. I know there's lots of skepticism and worry, but this thing is safe, and it will save your life and give you your life back.
One of the other areas, of course, that has been impacted by this has been just schools and the ability for our children to be in schools. We know that you have said vocally that you believe that we should be getting students back into the classroom. We're looking at some of these numbers that we're seeing in our daily COVID cases. Obviously, the numbers are going down. What are your thoughts, and have you had any discussions with education leaders to see how we can get students back into the classroom?
Yeah, this was an interesting process over the last couple of weeks. I talked to the governor, the superintendent, through staff, talked with Dr. Char, legislative leaders, mayors, and others, and everybody seems to be in agreement. We ought to open the schools as soon as possible. And the CDC changed their guidelines to basically say 6 feet of social distancing is not a prerequisite. It should be done to the greatest extent practical. And that is a big change in policy. And what that means is in places where there's low COVID, it is okay, and universal masking, it is okay to have kids 3 feet apart as long as they're masked and you're in a place where there's very, very low COVID. I had a constructive conversation with Corey Rosenlee from HSTA. I've been talking to both UPW and HGA. And I think the good news is that everybody is saying that they want to reopen in-person schools as quickly as possible. Now come the logistics, and this is where I worry a bit, is that if we have a collective determination to reopen the schools, that takes some doing. It takes curriculum changes. It takes the reconfiguration of physical space. It takes COVID protocols, new training for teachers and principals and other school staff. So if we've decided to do this, and I think we have collectively, although that's not a formal decision, but I haven't talked to a major education or government leader who doesn't agree we should reopen the schools as soon as it's possible, then the logistics are going to be tremendously challenging. And if we don't get started right away, then we're going to lose the fourth quarter of the academic year. And so the kind of logical pivot point would be for us to kind of operationalize some of this stuff so that we could have spring break and then try to do in-person learning to the greatest extent possible. Now, I just got to say this. There are certain teachers who are going to be needing reasonable accommodations because of their health issues, and that's a real thing. And there are parents who may want to continue with online for their kids, and that's a real thing. And so I'm not suggesting that we should flip a switch and just reopen the schools. I am suggesting that if the COVID rates stay this low or even continue on their downward trajectory, we have to be ready for the possibility that we could actually save the fourth quarter of this academic year. It'll take a lot of doing, and it'll take a lot of negotiating. And one of the conversations I had with Corey Rosenlee was, look, we should do this all within the context of collective bargaining. But I think we can do this if we have our shared values, which is we're going to respect our teachers, we're going to keep all of our school staff safe, we're going to keep the COVID rates low, and these kids need to be doing in-person learning because, as parents, I think there's a broad recognition that online learning is not as good as in-person learning.
Yeah, one of the questions here, Jose says, oh no, not that one. Sorry, this one. They go so fast. Why can't public schools open if private schools are open? I think there's a lot of anxiety in our community about the disparity between what's available to some students and not others. What are you hearing from parents? And I know you're a father yourself. What are your concerns about keeping a lot of kids at home and doing the distance learning, which we know is not working for all students?
Well, I think that's exactly right. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this, and I wanted to make sure I reached out to the teachers and the other school workers, in the first instance and not impose anything on them, because I know they want to get back into school, but they have a reasonable expectation of being safe. Now, we're in the process of vaccinating school personnel, and I think that would lend itself towards us reopening a little bit sooner. But the question is a really important one, which is that private schools have the financial resources, the space, the extra staffing to make this work. And part of my job is to try to deliver enough federal funds so that whatever is needed for public schools to open, is on the table. And I'm worried that we're creating, we already have a sort of separation between public and private schools in terms of the way things are approached. And it's gotten worse during COVID, where kids in private schools have continued apace and kids in public schools, some of them have been able to attend in-person school. I know Roosevelt is back up and running and doing so safely. So this is achievable, but I don't want to, try to pretend that it's just about announcing something. This takes logistics. This takes respect for school workers. This takes the integration of public health with public education. And so there's a lot of work that has to happen over the next 3 or 4 weeks to make this happen for the fourth quarter of the academic year.
I want to sort of pivot the conversation here and talk about, obviously we have a new president in office, and with that comes changes to different committees that are assigned within the Capitol. And you are someone that has been given the leadership mantle in some of these committees and assignments. We just get word that you are going to play a role in the Appropriations Committee as well. What can you tell us about some of the new assignments that you have been delegated to under the Biden administration and with what's happening in the U.S. Senate and the makeup of the U.S. Senate right now?
Yes. So I actually looked this up. I used to track it a little more carefully, but I just looked this up and I found out I'm Senator number 51 out of 100 in seniority. How time flies. I'm now the chairman of the subcommittee on appropriations that has jurisdiction over transportation and HUD. That's going to be a lot of fun. We can deal with housing and homelessness there, and HUD generally, and there's also transportation and transit issues. So that will be something for me to sink my teeth into and work really hard on. I'm also the chairman of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, and I'm very excited to do this with my friend, the vice chair of the committee, Lisa Murkowski. The cool thing about Lisa and I is that we had agreed that regardless of which one of us was chair and which one of us was vice chair, she's a Republican from Alaska, that we were going to be a true partnership. And we said this before we knew the outcome of Georgia. And she was super gracious because I think the expectation was she was going to be the chair. And now that she's the vice chair, it was sort of good that we locked in and sort of eyeball to eyeball. Look, we're just going to look out for each other and continue the kind of friendship that, you know, Frank Murkowski, her dad, had with the state of Hawaii, and of course Danny Noy and Ted Stevens, including on the Indian Affairs Committee. So I'm thrilled to be able to try to be helpful to Native people everywhere in what they call Indian country, but also Alaska Natives, and of course to try to fight for enhancing the trust relationship between the federal government and Native Hawaiians, and making sure that we get money for education, for broadband, for housing, and for health for Native Hawaiians. So I'm thrilled with my committee assignments. And then I also got on the Foreign Relations Committee, where I'm planning on focusing on two things: climate as a foreign relations and foreign policy issue, and the Asia Pacific region, because I think the Senate has a tendency to focus on Europe and the Middle East, and to the exclusion, or at least somewhat to the detriment of focusing on what we need to do in the Asia Pacific region.
You know, one of the things we see a lot of questions this morning about the unemployment delays, and I'm sure you're familiar that there's been, even though the last CARES funding to extend unemployment benefits for PEUC was actually approved under the last administration, there are still people in Hawaii who are waiting for those benefits. One of the things that Ann Pereira-Estacquio, who is a frequent guest here and heads up DLIR, says that basically it's a mainframe issue here in Hawaii, and that as these programs come out, because there's new programs, they have to create new basically infrastructure on the website, if you will. Is there a way to change the mechanism by which these programs are extended so that they don't have to do that every time, so that there aren't these long delays?
Yeah, this is something, I mean, so the answer is sort of. The mainframe issue and the sort of general technology infrastructure issue is something that we're trying to address in the $1.9 trillion relief package, to give money specifically to states to improve their infrastructure. But improving their infrastructure, frankly, isn't going to work in time to sort of fix this problem. So I don't want to lead anybody to believe that we're going to pass a bill and that we're going to be able to deploy money and fix the infrastructure. I think, unfortunately, the director of the Department of Labor is going to have to sort of operate the system that has, it's the old saying, you fight with the army you have, not the army that you wish you had. And I think that that's her unfortunate situation. I think they are working super hard, and that we have all been remiss in not investing in that kind of technology infrastructure. To be fair, nobody expected such a precipitous rise in the number of unemployed, because nobody anticipated a pandemic. And so the system could handle normal ups and downs, but not, getting knocked over like this.
I want to go back to your committee assignments, if we can, and you'd mentioned your role in the appropriations, specifically with transportation. How do you think that your role may be able to help with the rail project? We know that this continues to be something that is of concern, of course, to residents here who have been waiting for some time for this project to be completed. Funding continues to be a question and an issue. What kind of role, if any, do you see yourself playing in this as we continue to find ways to pay for this project?
Yeah, so I'm going to be as helpful as I possibly can as it relates to making the rail project work. But, they are facing a roughly $2 billion structural deficit. And the problem is that the delays, which I understand are necessary for both fiscal and sort of engineering reasons, probably drive the cost up because of just cost escalation from inflation, among other things. And so that $2 billion may end up being more than that. I want to give Lori Kahikina and Rick Blangiardi a little bit of space and time to develop a new plan. And I know both Lori and Mayor Blangiardi have sort of articulated that they want to be as straightforward as possible about the real situation, fiscally speaking, and go to the FTA and go to the community, right? And say, here's where we're really at. Because I think people are just sick of being told a sort of fantastical story about how there's some, magical solution to this problem. We are where we are because lots of people have told overly optimistic stories. And so I want to hear from them about where they think we really are. And then I'm going to engage with FTA and with HART and with the city and the legislature, if necessary, to figure out our path forward. But I think they've got a deficit of trust, both with the Federal Transit Administration, but also with the broader community. And so I think the next thing is for them to really rigorously analyze these numbers, come clean as to where we are, and then articulate a path forward. And then I'll try to be as helpful as possible. But I ain't going to be able to find $2 billion.
I want to ask you about January 6th. We had your colleague Ed Case on here a while back, and he told us a pretty harrowing story about what it was like on that day. Can you tell us where you were and what your experience was?
I was on the Senate floor, and James Langford was giving a speech, and he got interrupted, and the Vice President of the United States was quickly escorted off the floor, and then the President pro temp was quickly escorted off the floor. Now, the significance of that, from my perspective, is we're protected by Capitol Police generally, but only specific people have their own detail. And so if you think of what was happening in those moments, anyone who had specific responsibility to protect an individual immediately grabbed their protectee and got them off the floor. And so that was my first inkling that, something is going down. And all of this happens within maybe 30 or 40 or I don't know, a minute. And then they start actually locking the chamber doors and saying, lockdown, lockdown, lockdown. And a Capitol policeman yells, there are shots fired. And then they instruct us to sit in our seats. And I honestly don't know if it was 5 minutes or 1 minute, but from then they moved us out on a single file line. And there was noise outside. And now we know that famous video of Officer Goodman, redirecting the mob away from us. So I didn't see any of that. All I saw was doors locking, and then they moved us out. And my main concern moving out was I just happened to be next to a couple of members of the Senate who are in their late 70s, early 80s. So my main concern at that point was just making sure they didn't fall down these very hard and slippery marble stairs as we were being whisked away. And then we went to the holding area where we were safe. And only then did I kind of look at my phone and really truly understand, what was going on. I, logged onto Twitter and went, oh my goodness, text my family to let them know I was in a safe place, and then monitored it from there. But I guess my personal experience was I didn't feel particularly in danger until 2 or 3 days later when I realized how close of a call American-style democracy had that fateful day.
Obviously, since that time, a lot has happened with the trial and impeachment of former President Donald Trump, and the role that the U.S. Senate played last week in that, in the vote and the hearing that happened during that impeachment trial. Wanted to get your thoughts on that. Obviously, a lot of people knew going into it that it would be hard to get that Republican votes to sort of side with the Democrats, but this was by far the largest bipartisan impeachment that we've seen in U.S. history, with Republicans joining the Democrats on this. What are your thoughts on just the overall makeup with how that vote could impact the relations moving forward between both parties?
Well, a couple of observations. 57 votes was a big vote. As I was talking to some of the Republicans who were both considering voting to convict and then didn't in the end, and others who I thought were going to vote to convict, I thought the range of outcomes was anywhere from 1 Republican vote to 6, and it ended up being 7. And that's important. I mean, a bipartisan repudiation is important. Obviously, we were going for 67, not as a punishment, but as a protection going forward, and for the Senate to establish minimum standards of presidential conduct. So it was a disappointment on one level, but on the other hand, it's still better than it's ever been in terms of Republicans being willing to stand up for the rule of law. I do think the Republican Party is splintering. in ways that are going to be super challenging for them. But I'm a bystander in all of that. And so all I can do is try to work on areas where I agree with Republicans in the United States Senate. So, I think one of the things that President Biden has been so skillful at is, the old saying is the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And right now, the main thing is COVID relief. The main thing is not spending another 6 weeks sort of fully fleshing out President Trump's culpability in the January 6th insurrection. I actually think we need to do that, but I think giving a special committee like a 9/11 commission that responsibility allows it to happen in a sort of thorough and aggressive way, but it also allows us to deliver the relief that is primarily the reason that we took the Senate in the first place. People believed that Democrats were more focused on solving the COVID crisis economically and in terms of public health than Republicans. So now we have to deliver on that. We can't ignore what happened on January 6th, but lots of people don't have the luxury to spend 2 months waiting for us while we fight over what happened on January 6th. We're going to have to walk and chew gum. And I think our next major goal has to be to actually deliver COVID relief for the people of Hawaii.
And on that point, circling back to where we started, as people track the work that you're doing in Washington and they track this relief bill, it can feel so remote. And when we're talking about figures of, 1.7 trillion or however big this bill becomes, somebody says, I need $1,000 to pay my rent. So how do you, sort of feel connected? How do you advise the people, your constituents, to feel connected to the work that you're doing and to track it and to feel like that they're going to actually get some help?
Well, I think two things. First of all, in terms of letting me know what you think, our website actually works. It's schatz.senate.gov. And if you fill out that form, I'm always skeptical of filling out forms because I feel like some AI is going to read it and no human will read it. Those actually go to humans on my staff who read them. And sometimes to me, or sometimes just communicated to me sort of the substance of what was written. So I do receive that feedback. And then when and if we do pass legislation, we worked really hard to come up with fact sheets so that people could understand what they're entitled to, whether it's the cash assistance or the eviction moratorium or small business lending, or hopefully we're going to do some more SNAP benefits in this package, so that we want to basically make it simple so that anyone who's not super skilled in understanding how the government works can just read our little PDF and figure out who to call or what website to go to and make sure you access the maximum amount of relief to which you're entitled.
Yeah, we know those fact sheets really were handy during when this all happened. We were often referring to it here on the show. Our time is coming up here, and we certainly appreciate you taking the time to spend a half hour of your morning with us and with our viewers here. We wanted to give you an opportunity, though, to just have any final statements that you may have for those watching out there, those who continue to be impacted by COVID-19, and maybe just overall those who see what's happening in Washington, D.C. sometimes and are just somewhat disappointed with just all the partisan that we see in the news and all this that happens. Oftentimes it can get hard to trust that anything really is happening with all this fighting happening. What is your final message here this morning?
Well, I would just say we're going to work very hard to make sure that help is on the way. This is my highest priority, and we're moving forward. I mean, it's never fast enough, but next week the House will pass their bill, and hopefully a week or two after, the Senate will pass a bill and the president will sign it, and then relief will start flowing from that package. And I would just emphasize that we now have two pretty miraculous ways to fight COVID and get our lives back. One is the simple act of wearing a mask, and the other is to get vaccinated. Get vaccinated as soon as you can. Don't decide that you're not worthy of a vaccine and someone else should get it. If it's your turn to get a vaccine, go get a vaccine. If it's not for your own health and safety, it's certainly for the safety of and the health of those around you. But these vaccines work better than anybody could have possibly hoped for, and they're available earlier than people were reasonably expecting. And so our collective health as a society depends on the extent to which everybody decides to get vaccinated. And that's the message we have to spread among our friends, including people who have whatever suspicions or concerns those are the people you got to engage and make sure we save those lives too.
Okay, thank you so much again, Senator Brian Schatz, for spending your morning with us. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Aloha.
Wow, so much ground to cover there. And very interesting to hear how much he really values getting schools back in session. We had the lieutenant governor on here who said that he was sort of projecting a mid-May timeline, but the senator there saying that he's really trying to get everyone on board and work even faster, perhaps even after spring break, having a critical mass of Hawaii students back in the classroom. I know a lot of parents would love to see their kids back.
Yeah, he shared his conversations that he's having with the numerous officials that are involved in that process, and also mentioning that there is that collective agreement that, yes, we need to get kids back in school. It now becomes a logistical matter of how does that happen, and how does that happen to the degree that it is going to be something that, of course, teachers and students will be able to not only physically be in classroom, but also have the curriculum and everything in place, the logistical structure that can support this. And again, that goal of getting kids back in the fourth quarter may seem ambitious right now, but it's a conversation and plan that needs to be executed as soon as possible.
Yeah, some interesting specifics also in talking about the new CARES Act, looking at, obviously money for housing and for rental assistance, but also talking about giving money to venues, essentially restaurants or places, theaters, if you will, or musical venues, a lot of places that have really felt a lot of impact. And in Hawaii, as he did mention, we have, a large number of those because so much of our economy is catered to tourists who go and experience those venues. And that could be a huge relief for a lot of people who feel like they may have been left out of the prior rounds of funding.
Yeah, so we'll just have to wait to see what developments happen from Washington, D.C. with that COVID release package and just how much will be allocated. Of course, this package will also include direct funding for states and cities, which will allow them the opportunity to use that funding to help plug some of the holes that many of these states budgets are seeing right now, including what we're seeing here in Hawaii. So great to get an update from him. And it's always interesting to hear all the dynamics. We see what's happening on a national level. And it's always great to touch base with him to hear some of those personal stories, those anecdotes that he shared, of course, of what happened too with January 6th and his experience. But great to hear from him and that connection back with what's happening in DC.
Yeah, and some big news there also in terms of his projection that it's possible that the state could get enough money to avoid layoffs and furloughs. That would be incredible. The governor saying earlier that, they at least want to put that on pause until July, but the idea that they could bypass that altogether would be very meaningful for so many people in the state. So a lot of news in that interview. And then also we saw a lot of your questions about unemployment, and we will be tackling that with the director on Friday.
That's right. Emperor Estakio will be joining us. We always know that she's a popular guest here, and that this is a big week for the Department of Labor and Industrial Relations, specifically the Unemployment Office, as they start rolling out those payments to those who have been waiting for some time now. We'll get an update on her and how things are going there. We also know that there are some specific questions about certain programs, the extension of that, what happens when this next Biden administration CARES package passes through, how that will impact the mainframe once again, and if we will see another delay. We're going to try to get to as many questions as we possibly can, because we know that there are a lot of people out there still with a lot of questions regarding unemployment.
Absolutely. And then next week, we have Governor David Ige, who's joining us on Monday, Mufi Hanneman and Jeff Wagner from Outrigger joining us on Wednesday. And the folks from Movers and Shakas, that is a program to try to help to bring people from outside of the state to come and live and work in Hawaii. We'll be talking to them. That program, had a lot of applicants, and there were some here in Hawaii who don't think that it's necessarily a great idea. A lot of others in the business community do support that. So we'll be talking about that on next Friday. So be sure to join us. Until then, of course, have a great day, and we'll see you right back here Friday at 10:30 with Emperor Estakio of the Department of Labor and Industrial Relations.
We'll see you then. Aloha.